And it'll be on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of each week from 9:30 in the morning till noon. And we're spread out over 6 days. And we will be spread out in the social hall of the MACSHL. And dates are December 29, 30, and 31, and January 5th, 6th, and 7th. So I hope to see you there. We have scheduled 2 more upcoming lectures. The next one is Wednesday, January 20th, and it's a joint lecture between the library and McDonald School. The speaker is Eliav Benjamin, and he's going to talk about the Abraham Accords, what they mean, and what's happening around us. And the lecture after that is Wednesday, February 17th. Michael Ordman is going to talk about good times, better times, focusing on science and technology. And you don't have to mute your phones because we've muted all of you. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll go over them after the lecture. Now, a couple words about Leslie. Leslie Portnoy was born in 1939, and within months, the Second World War broke out. He was educated at Manchester Grammar School and the Victoria University of Manchester. He qualified as a barrister and practiced on the Northern Circuit in England, retiring to come on Aliyah in 2000. And within months, the Second Intifada broke out. He worked in Israel for a few years as a technical writer, employed by a multinational software company who he says paid me to follow a hobby. He's married to Stephanie, his long-suffering wife, for many years, and they have 2 children and 9 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. And he says he's not sure of these numbers because they don't keep still long enough for a reliable head count. He grows cacti and more conventional plants, reads a lot, and occasionally writes lectures on arcane subjects. Many years ago, Leslie suggested to me giving a lecture on the man who illuminated the diaspora. Either the library came up with different lectures, or Leslie found another topic to lecture on, and I'm delighted that we finally can hear about this personality.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Good evening to you all. Thank you for attending on Zoom. It's a lot easier than going out on a cold evening in late December. Thank you, Tzipi, for the introduction. I have also to thank Rabbi Rafal Katz for allowing me to use his study and his Zoom system to host the lecture. Rabbi Katz's generosity is greatly appreciated. I can hear my voice coming out, John. I must also thank my son for coming over to the shul to act as co-host so that I can just concentrate on the lecture. Actually, he's now the host and I'm the co-host, for what that's worth. I have to tell you, you're all muted, which means that even if you try to talk into your microphones, the system won't let you. Nobody will hear you. So if you want to ask a question or put yourself down for a question, you have to use the chat facility. At the bottom of the screen in the middle, you'll see a little square symbol with chat underneath it. If you want to ask a question, press on that and type your question. Johnny is going to act as a moderator, and he will control who we talk to and what happens at the end of the lecture. But I'm afraid he won't be able to interrupt, heckle, or otherwise disturb the lecture. Okay. One final preface: I intend to use the Ashkenazi pronunciation of the Hebrew words I must use. For one thing, this is a peculiarly Ashkenazi subject, and anyway, I find it easier. So on to the lecture itself. I wonder how many people here worked out the subject from the title. The 2-word Hebrew translation of the one who illuminates the diaspora is Maor HaGola, or Maor HaGola, and that is the title that was given by his contemporaries to the great Rabbeinu Gershom. He was, and still is, known as Rabbeinu Gershom Maor HaGola. He was one of the great figures in post-temple Jewish religious history. It is amazing but true that few people know anything about him, apart from the fact that he issued a ruling against polygamy. Sorry, let me just get rid of this. Thank you. Yet he was one of the first scholars to achieve renown in Ashkenazi Jewry, and he was possibly the greatest figure in the whole history of the Jews of Ashkenaz. In case you think I'm overstating the case, I want to quote a slightly edited passage translated from a Teshuvah, a rabbinical responsum, published quite a while ago. Rabbeinu Gershom, may the remembrance of the righteous and holy be for a blessing, illuminated the diaspora, and all of us live from his mouth. The entire diaspora in Germany are disciples of his disciples. On Zoom, I couldn't ask if anyone cared to guess who the author of the Teshuvah was. I can ask, but it's a pity because I suspect few will get the answer right. I just have to tell you. It was no less a personality than the great Rashi, who wrote that. His high opinion of Rabbeinu Gershom is shared by most people who know anything about the man, but not many people do. As early as the 14th century, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, or Rabbeinu Asher, wrote that Rabbeinu Gershom's writing were, as he put it and translated, such permanent fixtures that they may well have been handed down on Mount Sinai. So, what do we know about him? The short answer is not very much. But for those willing to dig, there is enough for more than one lecture. His name was Gershom ben Yehuda, and he was born about the year 960 of the Common Era in Metz. Metz is an ancient fortified city in the area known as Lorraine, in what is now northeastern France, close to its border with Germany. Some way off to the west lies Verdun, of First World War fame. Rather nearer to the east lies Saarbrücken, on the other side of the border. Today, Metz is the capital of the Moselle region of France. Although I've been speaking of France and Germany, don't fall into the trap of thinking that France and Germany of today existed then. In the Middle Ages, and until relatively recently, each was a feudal patchwork of small, independent administrative entities. Some were duchies, but many, if not most, were much smaller. Likewise, don't think of society at that time in modern terms. Populations were much smaller. So were cities. Most people lived a brutish, miserable, hand-to-mouth existence as subsistence farmers. In the event of any crop failure, large numbers of people starved to death. Violence was common, even apart from the small wars that were constantly being fought. Hygiene was non-existent, apart to some extent from the habits of the Jews, and disease wiped out large numbers of people. Life expectancy figures were low and infant mortality was high. Far less than half of the children who were born survived infancy, and fewer still reached adulthood in modern terms. At this time, literacy among the general population was rare and confined mostly to the clergy. Few records were kept, and as we will be hearing, far fewer survived the ensuing centuries of chaos. Nevertheless, records show, such records as survive, that at the time of Rabbeinu Gershom's birth, which was, as I say, in 960, Jews had been living in Metz for a very long time. There are records from the year 888 of the current era showing that Jews were already living there then. There are said to be records showing that Jews settled in Metz in the year 221 of the current era. Who knows when they really first arrived? Some say that they arrived after the destruction of the first Bet Hamikdash. Maybe it was even earlier. Some say they were trading there long before the first temple was destroyed. I said, and I've repeated, that Rabbeinu Gershom was born in about 960. That was soon after the beginning of one of the worst periods of persecution ever suffered by the Jews. I want to digress for a while to deal with this, because it is of some significance in the story that I have to tell. The Shoah, the Nazi Holocaust, was the worst persecution that the Jews have ever experienced. In terms of sheer numbers, it undoubtedly was. It was also characterized by the industrialization of Jew killing, the use of methods that weren't available until the Industrial Revolution had been going on for the best part of a century. However, if one thinks in terms of the proportion of world Jewry that was wiped out, 1/3, it had, unfortunately, many predecessors. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans was accompanied and followed by terrible massacres of huge numbers of Jews in the forgive me, in the Holy Land and elsewhere. After that, there was something of a lull, though some of the Muslim invaders of the Middle East and Europe brought their own brand of persecution and massacre with them, offering their hapless non-Muslim captive men the choice between conversion to Islam or instant death. The women were almost invariably raped and then either killed or swept away into the harems or slave markets of their conquerors. However, as time went on, the undoubted champion murderers of Jews were Christians. Entire communities of Jews were wiped out. Astonishingly high numbers of the Jews of Europe refused to convert to Christianity and were killed, most of them being first subjected to appalling tortures to try to persuade them to change their minds and be converted to become Christians. Entire communities were burned alive. I think everyone nowadays knows the story of the fate of the Jews of Blois in 1171 and how they are commemorated in almost every one of our shul services. Ask afterwards if you don't know the story. This frightful Christian persecution reached its climax with the Crusades, though it continued for many years, indeed many centuries, with varying degrees of fervor. In Metz, for instance, it lasted until 1365, when the Jews were expelled. They were allowed to return only 200 years later in 1567, after the French had taken over the area. There were other, excuse me, there were other similar expulsions across Europe. The Jews were expelled from Mainz, as we'll be hearing, as early as 1012. That's 12 years after the first millennium. The persecution was recorded in the many selichos and kinnos that were composed as it proceeded. They, with other contemporaneous records, make upsetting reading even today, in the period when the Shoah is still within living memory. Again, we face the problem of the widespread destruction of Jewish property and records. Nevertheless, many selichos and kinnos from this terrible period survive into our present-day selichos, kinnos, and thence into our machzorim. A single prominent example: every Yom Kippur during Ne'ilah, we recite the selicha Zachor Bris Avraham, and as we see, we recite it on other days when we say selichos as well. That was composed by Rabbeinu Gershom. It is one of the few compositions of his that survived into modern times. So he wasn't just a rabbi, he was a poet as well. Apart from the loss of human life, the biggest loss to Jewish learning brought about by the Christian persecution was the wholesale destruction of books. You may have heard me mention and talk about this in previous lectures that I've given. When we speak of the Talmud today, we think of 12 volumes, which is about the minimum number, or 15, or 20, or 24, or whatever. The well-known Art Scroll edition, they call it the Schottenstein edition of the Talmud translated into English, consists of no less than 73 volumes. But each page in our editions contains some basic text, plus on either side of the main basic text, the commentaries of Rashi and Tosfos, plus marginal notes by various authors, cross-references, alternative versions of the text, and so on. And I'm not going to do more than mention the volumes with English or Hebrew translations and footnotes. There were no printed books as we know them until the 15th century, when Johannes Gutenberg introduced the first mechanical press using movable metal type. All books until then were handwritten by scribes, copying from earlier books, a process that was bound to be and was fraught with error, with random omissions and unreliable additions. The entire Talmud would consist of one or two handwritten scrolls, or bundles of sheets of paper or animal hides bound like modern hardback books. There was no Rashi. He wasn't born until a couple of generations after Rabbeinu Gershom. There was no Tosafos. The earliest Tosafists were a couple of generations after Rashi and included as an early member his grandson, Rashbam. As I said, there were no lists of cross-references to other parts of the Talmud, nor references to halachic works, because there were very few of those. There was no HaGola Sabach, no Masoras Hashas, no Rabbeinu Hananel, just the basic Talmud text with copyist errors on almost every page. The entire library of Rashi may well have consisted of only 30 or perhaps 40 scrolls or primitive books on one shelf or perhaps two. Consider that, and then consider that in 1242, 24 cartloads of books identified as the Talmud were burned in Paris. And that was just the best known book burning. There were many more. It is amazing that any Jewish writings at all survived. As we will see, this affects Rabbeinu Gershom's writings as much as those of anyone else. And yet, even today, the famous Munich Talmud is still extant. It sounds incredible today, but it is just one volume. It contains the text of the Babylonian Talmud, handwritten, or more precisely, hand-copied, in 1342. Its text is as complete as any edition published since, apart from a couple of pages that have vanished over the centuries. It contains not only the whole Talmud, lacking only that couple of pages, but also other works, such as the Masechtas Katanos, including Sofrim, Kala, Gerim, and so on, and also some other texts with little, if any, connection with the Talmud. That volume physically consists of folios that were, or pages that were bound between outer covers like a modern hardback. I repeat, this is one volume that contains the whole Talmud and more besides. You can see the whole thing online. Just Google Munich Talmud. And this is some of the background to the story I want to tell. Rabbeinu Gershom grew up in the early years of this period, which was characterized by a teshuvah movement among the Jews in reaction to the terrible things that were happening in Europe. He went to Mainz to become a pupil and later the leading disciple of Rabbi Yehuda ben Meir HaKohen Leontin, known as Sir Leon or Sir Leontin, one of the founders of Talmudic scholarship in the areas now called France and Germany, the area that we think of as Ashkenaz. He also studied at the feet of other dominant Jewish scholars of the time. At some point, it appears that he took some training in the practice of medicine, to the extent that there was any training in those days. Anyway, there is cogent evidence that he had considerable medical knowledge in the light of the knowledge at that time. He also became a skilled goldsmith and silversmith, and at one point, at least in his life, he was well paid for practicing those skills. He was married when quite young to Devora, the daughter of Sir Leontin, who formed a very clear and favorable impression of the genius of his star pupil. Unfortunately, his wife died tragically while she was still very young. Rabbeinu Gershom remarried a widow named Bona, and they moved to Mainz. Mainz is the German name, but the city was also called in Old French Mayence, and in Jewish literature, for some reason that I can't fathom, it's usually called Magenza. It was one of the three Rhineland towns that formed the foundation of Ashkenazi Jewry, namely Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, the acronym of which you will see is SHUM, Shin for Speyer, Vav for Worms, and Mem for Mainz. There, after the death of Sir Leontin, he took over the yeshiva of which Sir Leontin had been the head, I mean in Mainz. It was already highly respected, and under Rabbeinu Gershom's leadership, it soon became renowned as the most prestigious center of Talmudic learning of the time, even surpassing the ancient Babylonian academies of Sura and Pompedisa, which were then still active. There he laid the foundations of two fields of academic work in the Ashkenazi countries, namely advanced Talmud studies and halachic decisions. Students flocked to his yeshiva from far and wide to study, even from Spain, Italy, Provence, and even Babylonia. There weren't cheap tourist flights in those days. They were very long journeys that these students would have to make, but they made them. After spending some time in the yeshiva, they would return to their communities, carrying with them reports of this brilliant sage and, of course, with considerable knowledge of his teachings. The result was that he was, even in his own time, hugely influential, and his influence was magnified by the spread of his writings carried by his students. 4 of those students, at least, are known to have become authorities in their own right because Rashi recorded their influence on him. Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, who was actually Rashi's principal teacher, but also Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yehuda, and Rabbi Eliezer HaGodol. Relatively few of Rabbeinu Gershom's actual writings on Torah and Talmudical subjects survived. His surviving commentaries on several Masechtas of the Talmud, several of the volumes that comprise the Talmud, are printed today in the standard editions. You can certainly find them in the Masechtas Tanis, Baba Basra, which is of course the longest of all, Tamura, Kerisus, Menachos, Chulin, Bechoros, Rochin, and Me'ilah. There may be others, but I don't think there are. A sefer written shortly after his death says that he produced commentaries on the whole Talmud, but most were lost in book burnings over the centuries. We know that he also produced a corrected version of the text of the whole Talmud. His corrections were based on various manuscripts and clarified many passages which had been obscure. This work has also disappeared, though it seems that much of the contents were incorporated in later texts of the Talmud. We know of some of his other lost writings from quotations contained in books written by his students and later scholars, and from references to them in the work of other sources before the originals finally vanished. He seems to have achieved far more than even the great Rashi. We know that Rashi had access to Talmudic texts in Rabbeinu Gershom's own handwriting, so they were still extant 2 generations later. By chance, a few months ago, I came across a comment in Maseches Sukkah where Rashi says in terms that he found the version of the text that he thinks is correct in a volume to which he had access, and that the book is in Rabbeinu Gershom's own handwriting. The Schottenstein Talmud Bavli, published by ArtScroll, with which I expect some of you will be familiar, refers in its footnotes from time to time to comments by Rabbeinu Gershom on other Masechtas apart from those I've mentioned. Presumably those have come from citations by scholars of the period. We also know that Rabbeinu Gershom wrote a book on the dietary laws called Hilchos Treifos, because there are quotations from it in our editions of Tosafos. He wrote at least 1 volume of Responsa to Shuvas, which may or may not have been called Sefer Rokeach. A work of that title is also attributed to Rabbi Elazar of Mainz, or Magenza, or Mayence. Maybe there were 2 works with the same name. Whatever the truth, that book is also lost, as are all his important works on the Masorah. His Teshuvos were widely cited and quoted, especially by his students, which is how we know about them. Some examples of another type of his work did survive intact, namely some of his Piyutim and Selichos. I mentioned Zechor Bris Avraham, which we say during Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur. It's also one of the Selichos that we say on Erev Rosh Hashanah, on Som Gedalia, and on the 5th penitential day. It's actually a shortened version, as I said, of the original Selicha. There are 3 other Selichos of which he is known to be the author. We say these annually, some more than once. His fame reaches to the present day because of something he did that had huge influence on Jewish life long after his death. Indeed, the influence continues up to the present day. Around the millennium, by which I mean the first millennium, around the year 1000, he summoned a convocation of rabbis, what modern scholars call a synod, to address social issues which had then newly arisen. Synod is a Greek word. It means assembly. When the Roman Catholic Church, Lahavdil, first held an assembly of its bishops, they called it a synod, and the name continues in use to this day. The synod would discuss the important issues of the day and produce a unified practice to be adopted by all the adherents of that church. In later centuries, as other variations of Christianity came into existence with the advent of the Protestant churches, they adopted the term for assemblies of their bishops or elders or whatever they called their fairly senior figures. Later still, synod was used to describe any ecclesiastical, governing or advisory assembly or council attended by delegated clergy and sometimes by delegated laity. Thus, the Church of England, Lahavdil, is governed by a body called the General Synod of the Church of England. If you think that I'm wrong in using the word adopted by and for the purposes of the Christian Church, let me make it clear that it is the term generally used by historians to describe the sort of assembly of religious authorities typified by those convened from time to time by Rabbeinu Gershom, especially the first one, the one that was held in or around the first millennial year, 1000 in the current era. Everybody speaks of the takonos of Rabbeinu Gershom, but how many can define a takona or even describe what it is? The best short translation I've come across is rabbinical decree. I'm not going to start to try to describe it in more detail because that's quite unnecessary for my present purpose. What I can add, without complicating things too much, is that any Beis Din can use a sanction of cherem to enforce the sort of decree that we formally call a takana. To put that in different words, if an individual, a Jewish individual, violates a formal takana made by some Beis Din as recognized as having sufficient authority, the Beis Din involved, on hearing of the violation, can formally declare a cherem. There was a generic name for the type of cherem imposed for a breach of any of the takonos of Rabbeinu Gershom, cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. The effect was, and still is, that the individual involved is boycotted, isolated among his fellow Jews. Among other things, and there are others, he is not welcomed in the synagogue, and if he goes there, he is totally ignored. Obviously, he receives no aliyah or other honor. His fellow Jews don't talk to him, they don't transact business with him, so he can neither buy nor sell anything from or to a Jew. They don't allow him within 4 amos, about 6 feet or 2 meters of them. I suppose I should say here that masks were not then required. There are more rules, but that will do. You get the idea. That punishment was certainly imposed for a breach of his takana against reading other people's letters. In the days when communications were difficult, prior to the invention of the electric telegraph, information was an extremely valuable commercial asset. For example, most Jews and many non-Jews know the story of Rothschild and the news of the Battle of Waterloo. The importance of secrecy in business matters was recognized by the Jews, and the use of the cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom to enforce the ban on opening other men's letters. And it was strictly enforced throughout Ashkenaz Jewry and is still a religious duty. The result was a general practice that arose among Jews to seal letters of importance with the acronym B'chadrag, which was an acronym of the words B'cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, B'chadrag. History records that letters so sealed were almost invariably treated as inviolable. Virtually nobody tampered with them. That was in marked contrast to the practices in the non-Jewish world of the Middle Ages, where the idea of privacy never took hold. To return to my topic, we speak of the takonos of Rabbeinu Gershom. The truth is that nominally, these were takonos of the whole synod. So they are not rulings, or they appeared not to be the rulings of a single voice, but the rulings of the most influential rabbis of the era in the Ashkenaz world. However, whether or not he produced them all himself, and many assert that he did, he undoubtedly had enormous influence on the decisions of the synod. No takana was passed by the synods convened by Rabbeinu Gershom that was not approved by him. How many takanas were there in all? Certainly far more than most people think. In one book, Rabbi Beryl Wines says that the number exceeds 90, and that number, more than 90, is also given by other scholars. Many of you will be familiar with Rabbi Baruch Taub, who retired here and gives regular shiurim here in Netanya, as well as at the OU in Jerusalem. Not long ago, in a shiur, he casually mentioned that the number of takonos by Rabbeinu Gershom that he had found in the introduction to Be'er HaGola, an ancient commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, was 93. I have to say, confess, I've spent some time trying to find this list, but I failed. However, some say there was a tendency to attribute any medieval tachonos to Rabbeinu Gershom. In 1220, for example, there appeared the tachonos of Shum. That's another acronym that I've already mentioned. It's made up of the initial letters of the names of the three cities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. For enforcement, after they'd been issued, those tachonos were backed up by the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. Well, that leaves the question: what tachonos were truly made by Rabbeinu Gershom? Everybody talks about the Jewish ban on polygamy as being a takona of Rabbeinu Gershom. It was, but it emerged as one of the takonos of the Synod, so that it had the authority of most of the great rabbis of the time. The Synod I'm speaking about there is the one in 1000. Those takonos dealt not only with religious matters, but also with social and economic aspects of life. Few people can identify any of them, apart from the one about polygamy. So let me start by naming a few of them. The ban on divorce without the consent of the wife. The ban on breaking betrothals without good reason and without the consent of the other party. The ban I mentioned a few minutes ago on opening or reading letters addressed to others. The ban on sharing in any way those who had let me start again this clause. The ban on shaming in any way those who had yielded under the duress of the Christian persecutors and torturers and consented to become Christians, but later repented and returned to Judaism. The ban on amending Talmudic texts, unless based on existing manuscripts. Anyone who's studied Gemara knows how often there are disputes about the correct text. And to complicate things, often an early copyist inserted into the text the comment of some recognized authority, or maybe even a comment of his own, as if it was part of the original text. This takona was aimed at putting an end to that practice. The rule that any enactment made by the seven leading Jews of the community, the expression is Sheva, Tove, or Ir, must be obeyed. The rule that every individual Jew must pay kehillah taxes immediately on demand and argue about whether he's entitled to exemption or a reduction afterwards. The rule that villagers who came to spend Yom Kippur in a larger town should be allowed to light their candles and leave them overnight in the synagogue. Those are some among many that are generally accepted as being takonos that were produced by Rabbeinu Gershom with the authority of his synod in the year 1000 or some later synod. Let's go back to more general matters. Forgive me. I am talking about the life of a personality who lived over 1,000 years ago. At that time, to quote Benjamin Disraeli, London was but a marsh. America was an undiscovered wilderness, which may or may not have had humans living in it. So Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the Philippines, the list is endless. There were no news media. There were very, very few books because they were extremely expensive. Even paper was extremely expensive in those days. They were making paper until last century. It is hardly surprising that we know very little more about Rabbeinu Gershom than I have mentioned. What we do know is mostly contained in legend, and there aren't even many of those. There are great gaps in the story of his life and many important things that we don't know about him. Let me tell you some of the legends that at least appear to be credible. It is widely believed, as I mentioned already, that at some point he trained in medicine and became a skilled physician, though it's not clear for how long or when he practiced that profession. I also mentioned that he appears to have also become a master goldsmith and silversmith. There is a story that when he was living in Constantinople, the then king, Basil II, employed him to build a magnificent silver throne. The story goes on to describe him as having been sentenced to death because some of the silver provided for the throne was stolen, and he was held responsible. He is said to have escaped and to have made good his escape of flight back to Mainz. One very affecting story survived the centuries, having been first recorded by the Ohr, Rabbi Yitzhak of Vienna, in his work Amelus, which he wrote in the 12th or early 13th century. The story dates back to the time of the persecution of the Jews of Mainz that culminated in their expulsion from the city in the year 1012. The Christians knew that Rabbeinu Gershom was immune to their proselytizing efforts, and that he'd succeeded in putting most local Jews into the same frame of mind. They appear to have deliberately targeted his son. Nobody knows what pressures were applied to the young man, nor the precise threats of torture and agonizing death that may have been made. Maybe some of those of torture were carried out. But what is known is that he yielded and he was baptized. There was nothing unusual about that, save perhaps the identity of his father. No family was immune. What very often happened was that when the persecutors moved on, the Jews who had yielded and accepted baptism would reappear, shamefaced, in the synagogue and beg to be allowed to return to their faith and their community. They were usually received with real sympathy, understanding, and charity, and the takonos that I mentioned meant that the one I mentioned actually, meant that nobody gave them a hard time or humiliated them. There seemed to be no reason to think that the son of Rabbeinu Gershom would not follow this path. However, illness supervened within a short time of his baptism, after only a matter of days, or maybe a week or two, and he died without ever having the opportunity to return to his Jewish faith. Rabbeinu Gershom was heartbroken. He sat shiva twice. I thought that was undisputed. When I mentioned it in the presence of Rabbi Katz, he said there was doubt about the truth of the story. I didn't then know the source of the story, the book by the Ohr, and I didn't argue. There are also different versions about when he sat shiva for the second time and why. Some say that he sat shiva once when his son was baptized and a second time when he died. Another version says that he sat shiva once after his son's death in the usual way, but at the end announced that he would sit another full 7-day shiva and did so. I particularly like the version that says he said he was sitting shiva once for the loss of the physical son and immediately after a second time for the loss of the soul of his son, who didn't have the opportunity to repent and return to the faith of his ancestors. It's been suggested that this, rather cynically I think, that this experience was the source of his takana, that those who were forcibly converted but then did teshuvah and sought to return to the Jewish community should be received with kindness and should not in later years be reminded of their lapse. That view seems to be mistaken, because there are at least two sources to say the conversion of his son was in 1012 in the current era, shortly before the expulsion of the Jews from the city. And if that's right, it was some years after the issue in the year 1000 of the takana that those converts who wanted to return to Judaism were to be welcomed and never reproached about what had happened. Apart from his takonos, he made many halachic decisions important enough to be mentioned by other contemporaneous and later authorities in their own Shalos Uteshuvos, published halachic decisions. 100 or more years earlier, Rabbi Natroni Gaon, who was the Gaon of Surah for some years in the middle of the 10th century, had ruled that a Kohen who'd been compelled to convert but later repented should not be allowed to perform the Siyas Kapayim, which we call duchening, in the synagogue. The author of the Machzor Vitri, Rabbi Simcha ben Shmuel, who died in 1105, 100 years after Rav Natrai, 50 years, 60 years after Rav Natrai Gaon, ruled that such a Kohen could indeed duchen, and quotes Rabbeinu Gershom's reasoning in his Teshuvah on the subject. So there's one. Many other halachic decisions of Rabbeinu Gershom are similarly recorded in the works of others on a number of topics, a variety of topics. Scholars cannot agree whether Rabbeinu Gershom died in 1928, which most accept as correct, or 1040, which has some support. There is an ancient, very worn gravestone in the old Jewish cemetery in Mainz with an incomplete inscription which reads, Hebrew lettering of course, in memory of Lezichron, Resh, as an abbreviation, Rabbi, Gershom ben Resh, and the rest is broken off. This is traditionally said to mark Rabbeinu Gershom's grave on the basis that, if complete, it would have read Lezichron Rav Gershom ben Rav Yehuda. However, whether that is or is not his grave, I can say that, unlike one prominent modern rabbi, there is general agreement that he is dead. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Thank you for joining me and for listening. And now if you want to put your questions into the chat, we'll see what comes up and what I can tell you.
One question up to now. What happened in Loire?
There's been one question up to now, my son tells me. What happened in Loire? The short answer is I've no idea. The Loire was part of Ashkenaz, but I don't think there were many Jews there. The Jews in France were concentrated in Provence, in Paris, and cities in northern France. I don't know anything about the Loire area. I can't give you an answer. I'm sorry. We've got another question. What's that, John? I've got 6 now. It was 5 before. No? Okay. No more questions? Okay, well, there we are. Nothing to add, have we? Okay. Sippy, do you want to take over? You better unmute it.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. And thank you to your son for everything he did. He was silent, but very much here. And I'm really glad you gave us another lecture.
Thank you very much. Okay, are we finished? In that case, if you have been, thank you for listening and good night.